Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that might seem small on a map but carries immense geopolitical weight. We're talking about a group of 8 tiny, uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. Depending on who you ask, they're called the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyu Islands. They're so small you could barely build a house on them, yet they're at the heart of a tense, decades-long dispute between 3 major powers: Japan, China, and Taiwan. How can these barren rocks be so important? Let's break it down. First, let's get the lay of the land. These islands are located northeast of Taiwan, west of Okinawa, and east of the Chinese mainland. Currently, Japan administers them, but both China and Taiwan lay claim to them, creating a complex triangular standoff. To understand how we got here, we need to go back in time, way back. The historical claims are the bedrock of this dispute. China and Taiwan argue that their history with the islands, which they call Diaoyu, dates back to the Ming dynasty. They present records from as early as 1372 that describe imperial envoys using the islands as navigational markers on their way to the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is modern-day Okinawa. From their perspective, these islands were discovered, named, and used by the Chinese centuries before Japan showed any interest. They contend that Japan illegally annexed these islands in 1895 after winning the First Sino-Japanese War. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki that ended the war, China ceded Taiwan and its appertaining islands to Japan. China and Taiwan argued that the Diaoyu Islands were part of this package and should have been returned along with Taiwan after World War II. Now, let's look at Japan's side of the story. Japan asserts that their engagement with the islands began much later but was legally sound. In 1885, the Japanese government began surveying the islands. They found them to be uninhabited and showing no signs of being under anyone else's control. In international law, this is a concept known as terra nullius, meaning nobody's land. Based on this finding, Japan officially incorporated the islands into Okinawa Prefecture in January 1895. Crucially, Japan argues this was a standalone act, completely separate from the treaty signed a few months later that gave them control of Taiwan. They see this as a legal, peaceful acquisition of unclaimed territory, not an act of wartime aggression. The end of World War II added another layer of complexity. Under the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan was forced to renounce its sovereignty over Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands. China and Taiwan interpret this to mean that the Diaoyu Islands, which they see as part of Taiwan, should have been returned to them. Japan, however, maintains that the Senkakus were never part of the territory ceded in 1895, so they weren't covered by the treaty. This is a fundamental disagreement over the interpretation of post-war treaties that continues to this day. After the war, a new player entered the scene: the United States. As part of the post-war occupation, the US took administrative control of Okinawa Prefecture, and this included the Senkaku Islands. This American administration lasted until 1972. Here's a critical point in the timeline. During this nearly 30-year period of US control, neither China nor Taiwan made any formal high-level objections to the islands being administered as part of Okinawa. In fact, some Chinese maps from the 1950s and 60s actually labeled the islands with their Japanese name, Senkaku, and showed them as part of Japan. This period of quiet is something Japan often points to as evidence that China's claim is a recent invention. So what changed? Well, as is often the case in geopolitics, the answer is resources. In 1968, a United Nations survey was conducted in the East China Sea, and its findings were explosive literally. The report suggested that the continental shelf in the area could hold significant reserves of oil and natural gas. Suddenly, these tiny, useless rocks weren't so useless anymore. They were potentially the key to unlocking vast energy wealth. This discovery completely changed the game. Just 3 years later, in 1971, the People's Republic of China made its first official claim of sovereignty over the islands. Taiwan had made its claim shortly before. The timing is undeniable, and it's why many see the dispute as being driven more by economics than by historical grievances. When the US returned Okinawa to Japan in 1972, it also returned administrative rights over the Senkaku Islands. However, the US took a carefully neutral position on the underlying sovereignty question, stating that it was a matter for the parties involved to resolve peacefully. But, and this is a big but, the US has consistently affirmed that because the islands are administered by Japan, they fall under the 1960 US-Japan Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. This is a massive factor. It means that if the islands were to be attacked, the United States would be treaty-bound to come to Japan's defense. This security guarantee is a major deterrent against any military action and significantly strengthens Japan's position. Beyond the potential for oil and gas, the islands hold immense strategic value. Control over them grants control over the surrounding waters and airspace. This includes the establishment of an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, which gives a country special rights over marine resources, including rich fishing grounds. The EEZ itself is another point of contention. Japan argues for a median line, splitting the distance between its territory and China's. China, however, argues for a much larger zone based on the principle of its continental shelf, naturally extending all the way to the Okinawa Trough, which is much closer to Japan. This would give China rights to a much larger slice of the sea and its resources. Furthermore, these islands sit astride critical shipping lanes, a huge portion of global trade, and more importantly, the energy imports that power the economies of both China and Japan pass through these waters. Both nations are deeply concerned that if the other gained full military control of the islands, they could potentially choke off these vital sea routes in a time of conflict. So, for both sides, it's a matter of national and economic security. They're not just fighting over rocks, they're fighting over the key to their economic lifelines. In recent years, the temperature of this dispute has risen dramatically. A major flashpoint occurred in 2012 when the Japanese government purchased 3 of the islands from their private Japanese owner. The stated goal was to prevent a more nationalistic Tokyo governor from buying them and potentially building facilities, which would have been even more provocative. But in Beijing, this was seen as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty and a move to permanently solidify Japanese control. This act triggered massive anti-Japanese protests across China and marked the beginning of a new, more confrontational phase. Since then, we've seen a pattern of escalating actions. China began sending its Coast Guard and naval vessels into the waters around the islands on a near-daily basis. A tactic often called gray zone warfare, designed to challenge Japan's administration without triggering an outright military conflict. In 2013, China unilaterally declared an Air Defense Identification Zone, or a DIZ, over a large part of the East China Sea, which completely overlapped the islands and even some of Japan and South Korea's existing zones. This requires aircraft passing through to identify themselves to Chinese authorities, a move seen as a direct challenge to Japan's control of the airspace. Japan has responded in kind. It has bolstered its own Coast Guard presence and, in 2016, activated a new radar and surveillance station on a nearby Japanese island, Yonaguni, to better monitor Chinese movements. The cycle of action and reaction has continued. In 2021, China passed a controversial law explicitly allowing its Coast Guard to use lethal force against foreign vessels in waters it claims. This raised alarms in Tokyo and Washington, as it significantly increases the risk of a miscalculation or accident spiraling into a real military clash. So, where does this leave us? We have a classic stalemate, but one that is getting more dangerous by the day. 3 governments, each with compelling historical, legal, and strategic arguments, are locked in a dispute over a few tiny specks of land. For Japan, it's about upholding the post-war international order and defending its territory. For China, it's about rectifying what it sees as a historical injustice from its century of humiliation and securing its rightful maritime resources. For Taiwan, its claim is similar to China's but is pursued independently. The situation is a delicate and dangerous dance. Every patrol boat, every flyby, every new law carries the risk of unintended escalation. Finding a peaceful resolution seems incredibly difficult, as any compromise would be seen as a major political loss at home for any of the leaders involved. For now, the world watches the East China Sea, hoping that these tiny, uninhabited islands don't become the spark for a major conflict. It's a powerful reminder that in geopolitics, size doesn't always matter. What do you think? Is there a path to a peaceful solution, or is this dispute destined to simmer indefinitely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. And if you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into global issues. See you next time.